From the special elections on Tuesday in South Carolina and Georgia to the race for Seth Whipper's House of Representatives seat, I speak exclusively with Charleston County Republican Party Chairman Larry Kobrovsky for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. Larry!
Well, first, Quintin, always good to see you.
Likewise. Thank you for this impromptu interview.
No, it's always a pleasure to see you, and like I always tell my family, I still can't figure out why I'm the first one to interview, but I consider it a great honor that you asked me.
Yes.
So thank you again.
Thank you. You're very welcome. Yeah, 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And let me take you to right now, because
Okay.
obviously the headline news is this, and this is from the WashingtonFreeBacon.com. It says this, the article that is, Republican Ralph Norman has won the special election to fill the vacated seat for South Carolina's 5th Congressional District.
Right.
Norman defeated Democrat Archie Burnell on Tuesday night for the seat vacated by current Office of Management and Budget Director Mick Mulvaney, the Associated Press reports. And apparently Norman won by 51% of the vote to 47.9% of the vote from Purnell. 51,
Roughly like that.
Right, exactly. And I was thinking of this. 51% to 47 tells you what about the future of this district?
Well, it's something I watched carefully, but people need to remember there was a really hard-fought primary there. And I think that the man who won, Norman, versus, I think his name was Pope, it only like half a percentage point separated them. So it was very, very close. I'm talking about the primary now, the Republican primary for that.
Oh yeah, Tommy Pope, yeah, right.
I think what you saw there is probably a little bit of carryover from that primary. When you have a primary, I've run in primaries,
right.
And when it's half and half split down the middle, and it was not just, it was pretty ideologically split. And you had, I think you saw repercussions of that in the turnout there, and they probably took it for granted. But I still think it's a safe seat. I think the bigger story was the one in Georgia.
Right.
And, you know, had the Democrats won that, I mean, the build up to that on much of the national media, whether it was CNN or the New York Times,
right.
If the Democrat had won, it would have been built up like extraterrestrial life has been found on Mars or something. It was like they would have portrayed it as the biggest event of the, you know, of this year and the end of Trump, the end of Republicans. So they're really building up, and you notice it was like when the Republican won by a lot, it was like a pinprick the balloon. It was like nothing about it. So I think what would have happened had the reverse happened, it would have been a huge story that all the media would have played up. That's the significance of it, because if you think about it, it shows that people are pretty much where they were before the election. I mean, Trump only won that district in Georgia by I think like 1%.
Right.
And I think the Republican won by about 5%, 5.5%. So that, despite the Democrat, you know, spending $31 million. So I think that is a big event. It was really big for what would have happened if the Democratic had won. There'd be, the mainstream media would have been nonstop coverage of the end of Republicans and Trump as we know it. So I thought it was a big deal.
And a lot of people don't know this, but Georgia's really heavily Republican.
It is, but that's part of the same demographics that if there was an article, I still read the New York Times because I feel it has a breadth of news that they talked about, I think, the 15 wealthiest congressional districts in the country.
Right.
And the higher the income, the more democratic they are, all of them. So I think you saw the same demographics of what took place in terms of that Georgia district, because it was an extremely wealthy district. So a lot of the same demographics you saw play out in Charleston County and the wealthiest ones across the country. My position is there's more socially elite people there, and they're removed maybe more from the day-to-day struggles of average people, and they tend to be more for the elitist Democrats, in my opinion, and that's reflected there. So that was a unique district. It has changed over the years as demographics change.
Yeah.
And remember, Trump only won by 1%. So if you look at what's happened now, the Republican won by 5.5%. That's a big change.
And let me stay in Charleston and really Dorchester counties, because as you know, Seth Whipper, he's retiring from the House of Representatives after 20 years.
Right.
And now the House of District 113, that is up for grabs.
Right.
You have Democrat Marvin Pendarvis in.
Right.
And obviously on Tuesday, Elder James Johnson announced exclusively to me that he's seriously considering running for that particular seat.
I didn't hear that, but you know, Elder Johnson and I go way back. I knew his mother was like I say another mother to me, and he's like a brother to me. Our politics are different, but I have great respect that he's an authentic voice for fighting for what he believes in based on where he grew up. He's an advocate for people he's known all his life, and he's very sincere in that. So our politics are different, but I mean, I have great respect for him personally. I think he'd tell you the same thing.
Speaking of politics, the
Right.
question I was thinking is this. Will you put in a Republican as nominee for that particular district?
Yeah, I think that we want to go all out, and provide an alternative. We're not going to cede any territory, and I think we will have, a number of people have expressed an interest in it. And I don't feel it's my place as
Right.
chairman to reveal them,
Right,
because
right.
if they're running their campaigns, they deserve to have the right to roll out their campaigns the way they want. But we intend to make a serious effort and show people an alternative. I think that's in everybody's interest to not be taken for granted. And that's a district we certainly want to make an effort and create inroads there. And that's for the good of everybody, it's for the good of the party and also for the people that live in that district. I think if you see, for instance, like in Allendale
Right.
County to take over the schools, I
Right.
was on the state school board.
Right.
And that came up to us, there were that district, and it was Burke and North Charleston High School.
Right.
So I think it's the people, blame the people there, but, they also, for 40 years now, it's been, the Title I money, probably trillions of dollars have gone into these districts that are failing. Nobody's ever evaluated that. Well, what's wrong? And that's what's driving this. If what is driving the success or failure is what, we're doing the same thing over and over again. What they always try to do is just double down on what they're doing, and they come up with the same results. I think what they're missing there is the fundamentals of education. That I remember there was lots of discipline problems there. Nobody ever wants to address that. And my sense is it's not going to solve everything, but until you address the discipline and structure in the classroom, nothing else can happen. And once you solve that problem, and that's why nobody wants to teach there, is violence and chaos. And that's what we are always told and what teachers told me. And nobody ever wants to address that. You have to address that first, and then you can do other things.
Can I address what's going on at 75 Calhoun? There's a lot of controversy and confusion going on down there, from the district office to the schools.
Right.
You've served on the school board back in the day when those were the good days.
Right. They were. Well, also when I was on the State Board of Education my first year, Postaway was the chairman of the state school board, so I'm familiar with her. At first I want to say that she was I always saw her as being of unquestioned integrity. I mean, her honesty was never in question. Her politics are very different than me. She was like, about as politically correct as you can be. And I remember she was very strong-willed and believed what she believed in. So, but I have not taken any position as to what happens there. I will say this.
Okay.
I'm familiar with from being on the school board and having an attorney involved in school board issues, the issue about the who chooses the principals. When you had the act of consolidation, there at one time was 21 districts or more, I think 23 in Charleston County. They consolidated it into one countywide district, and on paper it was that would be administrative. It would get the money and distribute it, and they kept, I think, 4 or 5 constituent boards, which were still supposed to kind of appoint the teachers, appoint the principals, do discipline, and assign students to school. So on paper, at least, you had decentralization and people in control of their communities. And what happened over time, Quintin, is that only the county board had the right, or it was interpreted to give money or to pay for lawyers. So anytime there was a dispute, the county board would have access to as much money as you wanted, and then the constituent boards, often modest people, would have to pay for that themselves. So there was always unequal fights, and over time, because of that, the county board did more and more. And a few years ago, the legislature gave the power to appoint principals to the county board. The county board has certain powers under the acting consolidation, the constituent boards, and the superintendent. According to statute, the superintendent still doesn't have the right to appoint a principal, so that's still a power that the board of trustees had. Now, they delegated that to the principal, to the superintendent. If you're asking me, I don't think you can delegate a constitutional power that the legislature gave you. So I think there is a constitutional and legal issue of whether the superintendent could appoint the principals. Whether it's a wise thing to do or not is not the issue. It may or may not be, because I'm not on the board right now.
Right.
But whether she has the actual legal right to do it, I think, in my opinion, is subject to serious question. but the chaos always seems the same, right?
I'm staying out that one.
As you know, from way back.
I just gotta ask questions.
Well, you deal with people's kids, and you're dealing with leftover racial issues and geography issues and people's identity, and it just seems to be the players change, but the issues are always the same. This, from my perception.
Right. And I know that you just handed me this particular notepad. Obviously, you just came back from what?
Right. Well, I just came. Quintin, it's very exciting for me. I spent two and a half weeks in Belarus and Lithuania, and that's where my family came from. My father's family came from little villages in what's now Belarus, and my mother's family from what is now Lithuania. And I took my daughter there, so that was very exciting to see the villages we came from. And I gave a presentation in Grodno, which is like the old historic city in Belarus, and they put it online, and they had it on Radio Free Europe, and it was really enlightening because a lot of people came. There were young people and students and intellectuals, and it was great to meet people there because and also I spoke at the school in Vidukla in Lithuania, where my family came from. The thing that's interesting there that I come from a world that no longer exists. There is a lot of the villages and towns were either mostly or all Jewish, and they don't exist anymore because when the Nazis came in, they executed everybody. So my whole life I wanted to know, it was always a mystery to me, because remember after nobody knew. Our family kept in communication with the relatives left behind, but then after the war was taken over by the Soviet Union, it was off limits. It might as well have been on the moon or Mars or something, because you couldn't communicate, you couldn't go there. And I went in 1984, many years ago, to try to go see the places. In Lithuania, there was one place you could stay in the whole country. This is still under the Soviet Union. So I went back 4 years ago again, and it was like going from black and white TV to color TV. And you can see when it was occupied by the Soviets, it was like everybody had their head bound down, and it was an occupied country. So it's literally amazing to see what people can do when they have the freedom to create their own culture and have independence and have the benefits of what you do yourself and the benefits of what you make of yourself. Because remember, under socialism and collectivism, it was all the same no matter how hard you worked and how hard you didn't work. So there was no desire to better yourself. And now in Belarus, it's a separate ethnic group and a separate country on paper than Russia, but it's still, they can be taken over by Russia at any time, as could Lithuania. So my mission was to kind of meet people there and because the first time when it's a young man, you go and you think, well, everybody's like a mass murderer because you know what happened. And when you're young, you always kind of have fire and brimstone. And over time, I've gone and you met people, and you realize that when you take those barriers down, I met some of the most wonderful people I ever met, and a lot in common with, and you begin to relate to them. And when you're inside looking out and you were Jewish, you looked like everybody that was local was participating in the murders and happy to do it. And when you're the outside looking in, you look at those who were the murderers and savages among us doing this to other people, but not everybody. So what I did in Lithuania, I got all the first-hand sources I could. There was one survivor of the village, of what happened. They took the men, in every village in Lithuania this happened, they took the men when the Germans came in, they executed the men, and they put the women and children in the synagogue awaiting execution. And he broke out the board and his story of what happened, how he escaped, and who saved him. And it was in Yiddish. I had it translated to English, and then I had it translated to Lithuanian. And last time I went, the Lithuanian school had presented to me, they had gone and done interviewing their grandparents and so forth, and doing a story from their perspective, how they tried to save people. A lot of people were saved. So I put it all in one book, because I thought everybody, is most concerned with what happens to them, and I thought it would be interesting for every side to see how the other side viewed it and learn, which you can't do if you're just hearing your own things. And then it's interesting historically, because if you're Lithuanian, everybody there was different ethnic groups, and that defined your rights. So no Jewish person would have thought of themselves as a Lithuanian, and no Lithuanian would have thought of a Jewish person as Lithuanian. The same thing for Belarusian, Poles, and Russians. They're all different ethnic groups based on your religion, had different rights, and were governed differently. And whoever won the latest war would impose, their rule and law and customs on the other people.
Yeah.
The people I belonged to didn't have any army or country at that time, so we were always, at the bottom. But in Lithuania, they had independence between the world wars, and then the Soviets took it over. So when the Nazis came in, the Lithuanians saw them as liberators from the communists who took their independence away. But if you were Jewish, you of course preferred the Soviets because
Right.
at least you weren't going to be killed.
Right.
So there was that conflict set up, whereas in Belarus there was no such conflict because you saw the Nazis as invaders. So it was very interesting for me to navigate that. And after the war, if you go to the villages, when all the structure is still there from when Jews were there, where the synagogue was,
Right.
and the businesses, and where the rabbis, all based on the religious structure, and the surrounding countryside was, where the other ethnic groups lived. So it's still there, but there's nobody that's Jewish left there. So it's a very, but it was a good chance for my daughter to meet people who could tell you what happened from still living there, and some of the people in their 80s and 90s now, but they remember, vividly. But to be in the same place, it was very compelling. I think there's a lot of lessons for that about historical memory. It taught me that, look, if you go in with the attitude, your ancestors were evil, your ancestors did this or that to us, you're never going to progress, because the people, you're never going to, there's nothing like a conversation ender if you go in and say, well, you're from a bad group of people who did this and that. Nobody, it's the end of a conversation if you start attacking what somebody's grandparents did. And, so to get beyond that, and I'll give you one anecdote.
Oh.
Just 1 second, a relative of mine went, who stayed behind. His family was still there during the war, his father and the father's brothers.
Oh.
And this was in Lithuania, Marching Kunias, and when the Nazis came in, the locals were going to execute them, they broke out into the woods and fought as partisans against the locals and against the Nazis. And he went back there 2 years ago and stayed in a little house in the village, and in the middle of the night he's talking to the person, and they told each other's last names. There was like a moment of freezing. It turns out that the person who you're staying with, in the middle of the night you're talking, his grandfather had murdered our family, and after the war, our family, when they got out of the woods, then executed him for murdering our family. So they, it was a tense moment, but the bottom line is they got to know each other and became friends and still correspond. So that's my point. If you stay, hating each other, what's the point? You can learn, and this, as I see the same thing happening here over historical memory, there's no point in like tearing down somebody else to build up yourself, and just to somehow you have a shared history that is more important, I think. So it's just my observation on that.
Well, Larry Kobrovsky.
Thanks for listening.
Oh, anytime, man, anytime. Larry Kobrovsky, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.